Hi, welcome to this Blender video tutorial entitled Binding Multiple Cameras to a Timeline. In an earlier video tutorial, I demonstrated how to set up and name multiple Blender cameras. It is possible to bind multiple Blender cameras to the Blender timeline so that they become the active camera when the timeline reaches a certain frame. To demonstrate how to bind multiple cameras to a timeline, I've placed a model of a grand piano in my Blender scene. In addition to the piano, I have added three camera objects to the scene: Camera 1, Camera 2, and Camera 3. In addition to the three cameras, I've also added an empty object called Camera Focus Empty. And on layer number 2, a Bezier circle object named Camera Path. What I intend to do here is to bind the three cameras to the Blender timeline so that at certain points in the animation, a specific camera becomes the active camera. I plan that my animation video will last 150 frames in length. I will thus set the animation length to 150 frames by changing the end frame to 150. I plan to use camera number 1 as an initial long shot that dollies closer to the piano over the first 30 frames of the video. I then want camera number 2 to be the active camera and display a still shot of the piano keyboard from frames 31 to 60. I then want camera number 3 to become the active camera, starting on frame number 61, and fly around the piano from frames 61 to 150. I'll begin by binding the three camera objects to the proper timeline frame. I'll select camera number 1, then making sure that I am in frame number 1 of the Blender animation timeline, I will click on View, Camera, Set Active Object as Camera. This sets camera number 1 as the active camera and displays the camera 1 view in the 3D viewport. Then, in the timeline header, I will click Marker, Add Marker. This creates a marker on frame number 1. Then on the timeline header, I will click View, Bind Camera to Markers. This binds camera number 1 to frame number 1 as the active camera. Then in the timeline header, I'll click Marker, Rename Marker, and change the name of the marker to camera number 1. I'll select camera number 2, then making sure that I'm in frame 31 on the Blender animation timeline, I will click on View, Camera, Set Active Object as Camera. This sets camera number 2 as the active camera and displays the camera number 2 view in the 3D viewport. Then in the timeline header, I will click Marker, Add Marker. This creates a marker on frame number 31. Then on the timeline header, I'll click View, Bind Camera to Markers. This binds camera number 2 to frame number 31 as the active camera. Then in the timeline header, I'll click Marker, Rename Marker, and change the name of this marker to camera number 2. I'll then select camera number 3. Then, making sure that I'm in frame 61 on the Blender animation timeline, I will click on View, Camera, Set Active Object as Camera. This sets camera number 3 as the active camera and displays the camera 3 view in the 3D viewport. Then in the timeline header, I will click Marker, Add a Marker. This creates a marker on frame number 61. Then on the timeline header, I'll click View, Bind Camera to Markers. This binds camera number 3 to frame number 61 as the active camera. Then in the timeline header, I will click Marker, Rename Marker, and change the name of the marker to camera number 3. I now have 3 different Blender cameras bound to 3 different frames in the animation timeline. I'll go back to frame number 1 and play the animation. Note that from frame 1 to frame 30, camera number 1 is the active camera. From frame 31 to frame 60, camera number 2 is the active camera. And from frame 61 through frame 150, camera number 3 is the active camera. I will stop the timeline and go to frame number 1. In the 3D header, I will click on View, Toggle Quad View, so I can see the front, side, top, and camera views. I'll select camera number 1 and zoom out a bit in my side view. Still on frame number 1, with camera 1 selected, and with my cursor in the side view, I'll press the I key and insert a location keyframe for camera number 1 on frame number 1. I'll then go to frame number 30. In side view, I'll position my camera number 1 object so that it's closer to the piano. I'll need to adjust the position in top view as well. Now with the camera number 1 repositioned for frame 30, I'll press the I key and insert another location keyframe for camera number 1 on frame 30. Now if I go back to frame number 1 and play the animation timeline, camera number 1 zooms in a bit on the piano during frames 1 to 30. On frame 31, camera number 2 becomes the active camera, and on frame number 61, camera number 3 becomes the active camera. I'll stop the timeline and go to frame 61. I plan on using camera number 2, as it is now bound to the timeline, as a still shot of the keyboard that covers frames 31 to 60. I plan to use camera number 3, now bound to the timeline starting on frame 61, to display a simple fly-around of the piano. I will use the camera path object as the fly-around path. And I will use the camera focus empty object to ensure that the camera number 3 is always focused at the center of the piano. To do this, I will first select camera number 3. I will need to constrain this camera to a path. But before I can do this, I have to reset the camera number 3 object's location and rotation setting to 0. With camera number 3 object selected, I'll press Alt-G. This will set the camera's location setting to X, Y, and Z equals 0. With the camera number 3 still selected, I'll then press Alt-R. This will set the camera's rotation setting to X, Y, and Z equals 0. You can see this on the notation panel on the right. Then with camera number 3 still selected, I'll click the Constraints icon in the right Properties panel and add a Follow Path constraint. In the target box, I'll select the camera path object. This places the camera number 3 on the Bezier circle or camera path object. Under Forward, I'll select -Z, and under Up, I'll select Y. This will orient the camera object so that it will properly face the piano later on. I'll then click on the Add Constraint button and add a second constraint, this time one named Track 2. In the target box, I'll select the Camera Focus empty object. Under 2, I'll select -Z, and under Up, I'll select Y. This forces the camera number 3 object to look at or track the Camera Focus empty object, no matter where the camera is located and no matter where the empty object is located. Next, I need to animate the camera around the camera path object. While still in frame number 61, I'll select the camera path object. And I'll click on the Object Data icon in the right Properties panel. In the Path Animation panel, by default, the Path Animation box is checked and the frames are set to 100 and the evaluation time to 0. I want the fly around animation to start on frame 61 and go to frame 150. I will set the frame settings to 150. While still in frame 61 on the timeline, I'll set the evaluation time to 0, then right-click the evaluation time box and select Insert Keyframe. This starts the path animation on frame number 61. I'll then go to frame 150. While in frame 150, I'll set the evaluation time to 150. Then right-click the evaluation time box and insert a keyframe. This will set the end of the path animation to frame 150. Now I will set the animation timeline back to 1 and play the animation. Note that camera number 1 zooms in from frame 1 to 30, camera number 2 is a still shot from frame number 31 to 60, and camera number 3 flies around the piano following the camera path from frame 61 through 150. I'll stop the animation and go back to frame number 1. I'll then click on the Render button in the Right Properties panel. I will leave the X resolution at 1920 pixels and the Y resolution at 1080 pixels, but I'll set the percentage to 25%. This means that my video will be 480 by 270 pixels. I'll scroll down to the Output panel and click on the Folder icon. This displays Blender's file locator. I'll select the desktop for the output destination for my video file, and I'll name it Piano. I'll then click Accept. I will then click on the Format drop-down box and select MPEG. I'll then open up the Encoding panel, and under Format, I'll select MPG4. I will then scroll up and click on the Render Animation button. This will begin the rendering of the video frame by frame in the image editor. This will take some time, so I'll pause this recording until the rendering is complete. The rendering is now complete, and I have an MPEG-4 video file now on my desktop named Piano 0001-0150.mpg4. I'll play this video. Camera number 1 is active for the first 30 frames, camera number 2 for the next 30 frames, and camera 3 for the last 90 frames.